We saw your prosperity, we saw your success, and we wanted to follow suit because we saw that it works. America does not have an example to follow.
We support both the right of individuals and couples to define, what marriage is for them, and we defend the right of people who are running businesses to not participate in a same-sex marriage if they don't want to.
Trump talks a lot about the swamp that he's about to drain.
I think there is a swamp. However, I don't think that there's been a lot of draining.
The only place Edward Snowden found refuge is in Putin's Russia, oppressive, enemy of freedom, all those things. But it's the only place that actually granted him asylum. What lessons have been learned since then? Здравствуйте, меня зовут Михаил Светов, и сегодня у меня в гостях Питер Гётлер, президент института Катона. И разговаривать мы будем про американскую политику, либертарианство, второй год правления Трампа, что случилось, как его выбрали, и как меняется американская политика в связи с тем, как прошли президентские выборы 2 года назад. Выпуск будет на английском, поэтому сейчас включатся субтитры. Thank you, Peter, for coming.
Mikhail, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Tell the viewers a bit about Cato Institute and what it does, and what do you feel like its biggest achievements are?
Sure. Cato Institute was founded a little over 40 years ago in 1977, and it's a public policy research organization. In the US, we call that a think tank, but it engages in research, analysis, and advocacy for libertarian values, libertarian philosophy, and libertarian, public policy solutions. And we have a vision of free and open societies with, a great deal of individual liberty, economic freedom, and hence prosperity and, a very high level of civil harmony.
And what would you pinpoint as your signature achievement of your work since the 70s?
It's really the mainstreaming of libertarianism as a legitimate and respected political philosophy. Libertarians now have a seat at the table that they didn't have 40 years ago, and I think that's a very important achievement.
And Cato Institute was funded by Murray Rothbard himself, right?
It was actually co-founded by Charles Koch and Ed Crane, two noted libertarians in the United States. Murray Rothbard was involved in the early going, but Charles is a businessman who holds a libertarian philosophy as well, and much of his philanthropy is related to trying to advance the principles of individual liberty and freedom. Ed had come to Washington and saw that the American Enterprise Institute was an existing think tank that advocated for conservative principles. The Brookings Institution is probably the oldest and largest think tank in the United States, and that's generally seen as more of a liberal in the United States sense, more left-leaning, more associated with Democrats. And Ed really had the vision that libertarians needed to have a respectable voice, an organization that would develop and promulgate public policy solutions and research from the libertarian point of view.
Who do you think today's most exciting libertarian in the United States?
It's kind of hard to say because I don't think there's one dominant voice or a preeminent spokesperson for libertarianism the way it might have been, let's say, in decades past when Milton Friedman was seen as a very high-profile and credible libertarian in the United States. And a lot of people say, hey, where are we going to find the next Milton Friedman? But I think maybe we have to look at it a little bit in a different way. When I talked about Cato mainstreaming libertarianism, we now have respected and recognized libertarians or libertarian-leaning people serving in public office in the United States, which is relatively new. We have, Senator Rand Paul is clearly associated with the libertarian philosophy. Justin Amash, who people in Russia may be less familiar with, is a member of the House of Representatives, and he's probably the most libertarian, member of Congress. And I think that both of these gentlemen are seen as being very principled, which I think is important to basically for people to understand that libertarianism is a philosophy, and it's based on the principles and values of individual liberty and limited government. So to have people serving who are seen as upholding those principles in the Congress to the best of their ability is something that we didn't have in decades past when Cato was founded.
Do you think the idea that libertarians may somehow take over the Republican Party in the future is something that is possible, or it's just a pipe dream?
Around the time Cato was founded was when the Libertarian Party started in the early 70s, or maybe it was the late 60s. And there was a lot of hope that there was increasing disenchantment with the kind of two-party system, Republicans and Democrats, and that a third party was going to emerge, and it might be the Libertarian Party. But there are a lot of rules in American politics that really favor the duopoly of Democrats and Republicans. For example, it's very difficult for a third party or independent candidate to get in presidential debates. So that makes it hard for candidates that aren't Republicans or Democrats to get the kind of profile necessary to run for office successfully. And I think historically libertarians have felt more kinship with Republicans because Republicans have at least espoused, you know, an idea of limited government. But I think that the intertwining of libertarians and conservatives hasn't necessarily served libertarians well in the United States. Because if you allow libertarianism to be defined as some kind of minority strain of conservatism, you're self-defining as a minority of half of the system. And so you're almost ensuring that you have perpetual minority status. And I also think, you know, libertarians philosophically they recognize that, you know, we have as many areas of agreement and disagreement with Republicans as we do with Democrats. I mean, we really are you know, very distinct, and I think libertarians defy categorization along the typical left-right, you know, political spectrum. One of the great things about Cato, because it's one of the few organizations in Washington that is legitimately independent and nonpartisan and very principled, is that allows us to constructively engage with people across the spectrum. I think the biggest threat to the rule of law in the United States is the fact that we have degenerated into a very tribal political situation where you have Democrats and Republicans primarily identifying with their own group and demonizing the other group. And it causes people to not be objective about what politicians and policymakers who they may support are doing. What I encourage people to do, both Democratic friends and Republican friends, that preserving the rule of law is of utmost importance. So we all have to be willing to call out, you know, politicians who we may support when we think that they're contravening the rule of law, and we have to be willing to accept that the end doesn't justify the means.
It's been 2 years since Trump's been elected. What do you think has happened, and what lessons have been learned since then?
You know, the economic situation in the United States. We've undergone a long period of economic growth that's kind of below trend. I may have the statistics a little bit wrong, but I think going back to like the early 30s, the U.S. has never gone more than 3 years without having at least a year of 3% real GDP growth.
Yep.
And before the election of Trump, we had gone 10 or 11 years without a single year of GDP growth of at least 3%. And I think that creates a lot of economic stress that exists. And I think that I see the rise of Trump as being a misdiagnosis of the issues or what's causing that economic underperformance. I see it as being related to the size of government, the increasing role of government, particularly in the regulatory space, the regulatory burden that has made robust economic growth more difficult. But yet, in the campaign, it emerged a lot of focus on immigration, a lot of focus on trade, and I think that's kind of scapegoating, you know, some of the reasons. It's a lot easier to explain to people who are undergoing economic distress and maybe unemployed or underemployed that, oh, your job has been taken by someone overseas because of trade, or an immigrant has come in and taken your job. But I don't see that as the right diagnosis of cause and effect. But it's pretty simple for people to, that's a simple concept for people to understand, so they fall for it in some ways.
But Trump is getting a lot of credit, or trying to get a lot of credit for the economic growth that is happening right now in the States. And you did get this year of over 3% growth in the US under Trump.
I think we tend to give politicians too much credit for good economic performance and too much blame for economic underperformance. But I think clearly there have been some policy decisions that have made a difference. You know, something that Cato's talked about for more than a decade is the fact that there's emerged global tax competition. You've had declines in corporate income taxes in most of the developed world, and the U.S. went from being kind of in a pretty average position in terms of corporate tax rate to having one of the highest in the developed world. So cutting that tax rate became a very important policy objective. That happened through the tax reform that was passed late last year. I mentioned the impact that I think the regulatory burden has had on curbing economic growth. And a part of the Trump agenda, policy agenda, has been deregulation and rolling back some of these regulations. And that, to me, actually has been a pleasant surprise, because that's not something that he talked a lot about.
But he's a businessman.
Yeah, and that's what people ascribe it to. They say, particularly in real estate, he operated in an area where there was a lot of onerous, local regulation that had to be overcome to execute real estate projects. So he understands that. And so I think those things, you have to give some credit for the economic rebound to that. But also you have to keep things in perspective. The headline numbers of GDP growth have been better. The job growth number, the increase in payroll employment each month has continued to be positive, although not that different from what it was in the last year or two of the Obama administration. I actually read something recently that said in the first 18 or 19 months that Trump has been president, payroll employment increase every month has actually been, it's remained positive, but it's been on average a little bit lower than what it was in the last 18 or 19 months of the Obama administration. But we also know, though, that the impact of economic policy changes takes some time, and it is always a bit amusing to me that we tend to measure the economic performance that we give a president credit or blame for, and as I said, usually too much credit or too much blame, right when they take office. So to basically measure, what economic growth or payroll employment increase over the first year and a half of the Trump administration has been doesn't make all that much sense to me.
Trump talks a lot about the swamp that he's about to drain. Is there really a swamp that needs draining in the United States politics today?
I think there is a swamp. And however, I don't think that there's been a lot of draining going on. One of the things that's really disappointing as a libertarian who believes in limited government, I think the size of the government sector is just way too big. It spends too much money, and that hasn't changed at all. Addressing that long-term fiscal trajectory is, to me, an important part of draining the swamp, trying to eliminate the impact of lobbyists and rent seekers in the Capitol is important. I don't see a lot of that happening.
So having said that, what do you think is alternative to a rising populist movement? Because as things get worse, there will be more demand for this populist approach, where people promise a lot but don't deliver. And Trump can be just the first omen of things to come, not even the worst one.
I think that's one of the things that makes it makes the role of organizations like Cato really important. We don't allow kind of emotional populist rhetoric to obscure the fact that these are problems that have been long in the making, and problems that are directly related to politicians over-promising.
Yeah, but you're not going to curb the rise of populism just by saying the right thing, because if people voted for the guy with the best facts, people would not vote for Chavez, they would not vote for Maduro, for Bernie Sanders, for Putin, for people like that. So I don't think just having the best facts is good enough to inspire change. I think you need to sell your ideas. The approach I kind of try to take in Russia is I'm trying to make libertarianism popular by being populist. And I'm still a hardcore libertarian, but you need to pick up, core issues that are easy to sell, that will have people rallied up behind you, that will hopefully bring you to power, or bring a libertarian in the US to power. So he can bring about all the changes that you're talking about. All of them are important, but it's not enough just to be an intellectual. You have to be a politician. And in my opinion, at least, the lesson of the Trump's victory is that he's a natural-born politician. He feels the public opinion. He connects with the general public, and that's something I think libertarians can really learn from his victory. Otherwise, you just surrender the initiative to people who are just going to make things worse.
Oh, I think that's right, but there's also a difference when we're talking about the role of Cato versus, hey, what I think is best for libertarians, right? There are a couple of student organizations in the United States, Students for Liberty, which was actually incubated in the offices of Cato, but it's an independent organization, Young Americans for Liberty. These organizations have thousands of members. They have chapters on hundreds of campuses. They're an important part of the movement in speaking to young people, and they can do it in a way that's more exciting and more relatable. And I view our role as having important linkages with them and relationships with them, where we can provide some of the kind of intellectual ammo, or some of the materials that we can distribute through technology that makes their job easier, so they can be the retailers of these ideas on campus to young people, and we're more the wholesalers, while we're also the kind of intellectual and philosophical stewards of the ideas.
Do you think it's healthy for a democracy to have political dynasties, and how did they come to form in the US? And I'm not just talking about Roosevelt's and the Bushes and the Clintons and Kennedys. I mean, in every state, you have a dynasty that's been in Congress or in Senate for hundreds of years, like the Murkowskis in Alaska, the Udalls, the Rodneys in Delaware. They're everywhere. And when you look at the list of congressmen, it's like a good portion of them been in Congress or in Senate for decades. And their father was a senator, and their grandfather was a senator. And is it healthy for a democracy?
No, I mean, I wish it weren't that way, because it does erode, confidence in the system, and prevents, new people with new ideas, entering the process. It's really too bad that we have these people that are in Congress for decades.
It happens even among people that I really like Ron Paul and Rand Paul. It's a dynasty, even though a small one.
Yeah. Within Congress, it doesn't concern me quite so much, because it's not a huge part of the Congress. To me, it's a little bit more concerning at the presidential level, because presidents, have so much power, and running for president is incredibly difficult and challenging, and that's where the name recognition and fundraising ability that comes from both name recognition and having kind of an established fundraising machine like the Clintons have and the Bushes have, becomes a big advantage. And yeah, I can see why it happens. It's too bad, because I'd rather see different candidates, new candidates. There was a time when Jeb Bush entered the last presidential nominating process, when everyone was betting it was going to be, a rematch between a Clinton and a Bush. It was going to be Hillary versus Jeb Bush, and oh my God,
that was a depressing thought.
Yeah, it was quite depressing.
So, and it's a perfect fuel for the kind of populist sentiment that Trump used to get elected.
Trump has clearly tapped into something, and he's a very savvy political, entrepreneur. But I do wonder, even though some of these issues are going to persist, I wonder if there is someone else, either on the Democratic side or Republican side, who will be as effective a populist as Trump. And that leads me to question whether this kind of rise of populism is going to be sustained, or whether it's going to pass, you know, with the ending of the Trump era. He's a pretty unique individual,
he is,
and
yeah.
even people who are trying to tap into the same issues of immigration and trade, I'm not sure they're going to be able to pull it off as well. I think of any other of the kind of Republicans who you might think about being in the next next wave of Republican presidential aspirants after Trump leaves office. And it's hard for me to imagine any of them pulling this stuff off.
Why immigration became such a dividing issue for Republicans?
There was data showing that in the election, the last American election, the areas where people cared the most about immigration as an issue wasn't necessarily where the most immigrants were, but it's where there was the most change in, so even from very low levels, but there was a change in the amount of immigrants living in those areas. So they weren't necessarily high immigrant levels, but an increased number of immigrants. And to me, that just indicates that, you know, there's fear of change, you know, natural human fear of change, fear of unknown, and a lot of what's going on now, economic changes, technological changes, against that backdrop, when people see their country changing in certain ways, it becomes frightening to them. Mm-hmm. I view trade and immigration more as scapegoats for other problems that are have been created by the government. Most immigrants who come to the U.S. are coming to work, not to collect public assistance. Most immigrants are assimilating. They're not failing to assimilate.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the rise of identity politics and the kind of identitarian argument that people make against rising immigration?
That the right makes?
The right and the left. There's this whole culture war thing going on right now. What do you think can be a libertarian answer to that problem?
Well, there is a libertarian response that I think is implicit, you know, in our philosophy. I mean, Cato was the only organization I'm aware of that filed a brief in the Supreme Court cases, both the case supporting same-sex marriage mm-hmm. and the case supporting the baker's right not to make a cake for a same-sex marriage. And those are both libertarian positions. And I think that it's intellectually honest as well, that, you know, we support both the right of individuals and couples to define, you know, what marriage is for them, mm-hmm. and we defend the right of people who are running businesses to exercise their freedom of conscience, and their own religious liberty to not participate in a mm-hmm. same-sex marriage if they don't want to.
There's a lot of misconception about what the right is in the West as well as in Russia right now. So, and the way the left started phrasing the idea of the right as it became a privilege. So basically, you have a right to Medicare,
right.
to healthcare, right?
Right, and we push back hard on that because we're about negative rights, not positive rights. Mm-hmm. And as a libertarian, what concerns me is that, you know, the limited government message has gotten completely lost right now.
Do you think libertarians will ever get a chance to actually act on this message and change something for the better in the kind of environment that exists today?
Yes, I mean, are we going to soon live in, you know, what we call libertopia, you know, the free and open libertarian society that we all desire? You know, no, but are we going to have opportunities to move policy in the right, you know, in the right direction? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about what, as a libertarian, one of the most important issues is, or one of the important concerns, the government's ability to lock you up. There's been increasing recognition that the U.S., we have a disproportionate share of the world's inmates compared to our share of the world's population. And there's been much increased focus on the criminal justice system, you know, from both sides. And we see real opportunities to address the over-criminalization, passing too many laws that make it much easier for people to disobey laws. the coercive plea bargaining on the part of prosecutors that make it more difficult for people to go to trial and exonerate themselves, the lack of accountability for misconduct or violations of people's rights that might occur by prosecutors or by law enforcement. And I think there are going to be important opportunities to change policy in those areas and to see a coalition that includes people, not just libertarians, but people from the left and people from the right. And that's a pretty important issue if you're talking about keeping people out of prison who might be put there unjustly.
And are there historical examples where a bigger state evolved through democratic institutions towards a smaller, freer state? In case of the American founding fathers, there was American Revolution. It was not exactly evolutionary process. Because there's the German libertarian Hans-Hermann Hoppe, he's actually making a case that government will always grow in size, because that's in nature of democracy. To increase the number of laws.
Yeah, that's similar to what Jefferson said, that the natural course of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Yeah, I'm not sure that's really true, because certainly there's been a lot of revolutionary change really over the course of my lifetime. The world is much freer than it was when I was born. There are lots of imperfect democracies and a lot of imperfect societies that don't necessarily represent the free and open outcome that we desire, but are vast improvements over what existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. If you just look at the change in the downfall of communist regimes and the evolution of communist regimes, like China, where there's still not the political liberalization that we would all want, but there's been a lot of market liberalization. In the UK in the 1970s, the government either produced or regulated almost everything that you came in contact with. The automakers were government owned, the airline was government owned, the airports, and through the Thatcher, not revolution but evolution, that changed pretty dramatically. They
had an example that they could follow, which is an American example, which it was the same in case of China and Russia. We saw your prosperity, we saw your success, and we wanted to follow suit because we saw that it works. America does not have an example to follow because you were kind of the leaders of the free world, right? And now that your government has been becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, the world is kind of losing that beacon of freedom and hope. And it creates a very difficult situation for an evolutionary change, I think, in terms of messaging. Because in the Soviet Union, for example, or in China, messaging was pretty simple. We're starving, look at the states, they have everything, right? And there you go, that's all you needed to advance the market economy.
Right. We have to be careful, though, when we say that government just keeps growing and growing and growing, because it's growing in some areas, it's kind of yielding in others. Those of us who believe in limited government, it's easy to get discouraged because the government is much larger than we want it to be. But you do have to keep perspective and recognize the areas where government is growing and where it's not. In the US, we've had a tremendous increase in social tolerance. That's been positive and has had a positive impact on freedom. We've had we're in the early stages of educational reform, increases in educational freedom. There was only, if you go back 30 years or 35 years ago, there was only, one jurisdiction in the US that had a school choice program. Now we have almost half the states have school choice educational freedom programs of varying quality, but that's a movement in a positive direction. I mentioned criminal justice, where I think there's scope for reform. These are areas where freedom's increasing. The regulatory burden has grown until now. There seems to be some positive change under the current administration. Government spending is way too high. I'm concerned about these entitlement programs that are on autopilot. But even there, if you keep things in perspective, you look back over the last 40 years, government spending as a share of GDP in the States hasn't really changed that much. So it's bigger than it should be, it's bigger than I want it to be, but the impression that, hey, government in all areas has just gotten bigger and bigger in the U.S. really doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
So you think the general trend is for the better?
I think the general trend is positive some areas, negative in others, concerning in the economic realm, more positive in other realms. The trend over 30, 40 years has been pretty stable.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the issue of government debt in the U.S. is actually something that is overblown by the conservatives, or is it a real issue that needs to be solved? And if so, how do you think it can be solved?
In the economic arena, the role of government is a big concern, and the future of the entitlement programs does concern me a lot. I actually think it's immoral, right? Because we are teeing up future generations to have to bear the burden, either in reduced opportunity or actually paying for health care for the elderly, for Social Security for the elderly. So I think there's an aspect of it that's immoral. Some of us believe that it will be difficult to make progress on that issue until we do find ourselves in a crisis created by the debt. So that's very concerning, because right now there's not enough focus of policymakers and media on that issue.
And you think this kind of crisis is an actual possibility in
well, if you look at the size, if you look at the spending on Medicare and Social Security and the unfunded liabilities of those programs, could there come a time when the U.S. has trouble rolling over its debt if it doesn't change, the benefit levels, the tax levels of those programs? I think absolutely. So
do you think America can default on its debt at all?
Well, that's the kind of crisis that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily an outright default, but yeah, do you get to a point where it's very difficult to roll over? There's a feeling in the United States that, hey, if we just raise the level of taxes on a bunch of rich people, we can pay for all these entitlement programs. And it's just not true. I mean, maybe you can have an increased tax burden on upper income people to create a safety net for lower income people. And I'm not suggesting whether that's a good thing or not, or something that's consistent with our philosophy. But you can't tax upper income people enough to provide lifetime health care and retirement benefits to everyone else, to the entire middle class. The math just doesn't work. It's really tautological that middle class people in the U.S. over the course of their lifetime really have to pay their own way. And
does anyone outside of Cato realize those issues, or at least think long term about saving them, or it's just?
Oh yeah, no, and it's something, and I think it's really important, as I said earlier, that even issues where we think there isn't the scope to make near-term progress on it, it's essential to keep talking about them.
So do you think there's a real possibility of another amendment to the Constitution passing, and what do you think it's going to be?
It's probably unlikely, but there is a movement underway. There are two ways that you can amend the Constitution. One is for amendments to be proposed by the Congress, and as a result, there are not examples of many amendments that haven't increased the power of the federal government and hence the Congress. But the Constitution also provides under Article 5 for calling a convention of the states. And there is a movement underway in the U.S. to try to call a convention that would propose amendments on issues. The ones that you hear about most are a balanced budget amendment to try to address some of the fiscal dangers that we've been talking about. Another is to amend the Constitution to allow for term limits. It's still a heavy lift to get to that kind of convention. There's a lot of concern that, what else might happen come out of a convention like that. And also, I don't see things like a balanced budget amendment or term limits being silver bullets that are going to solve the problems that have built up in our system.
You came to Russia as a group that includes Senator Rand Paul. And
yes.
So I don't think we ever had so many senators coming to Russia as in recent times.
It's kind of interesting. We started talking about this trip late last year, and I didn't anticipate that it was going to attract so much attention. And part of that is because there was just a summit in Helsinki between Trump and Putin, and that wasn't anticipated when we put this trip together. I've done a lot of traveling, you know, around the world. It's part of my interest in freedom. I met you first almost 2 years ago when I visited Russia. I find it essential. I try to be informed. I try to study what's going on in other countries, but you never really know until you visit a place what's happening and what the country is really like. But I also want to meet the people who are working to promote liberty, particularly in places that aren't particularly free, because I'm very inspired by them. When I meet someone such as yourself, who's working to promote freedom in Russia, I return to the U.S. with a greater sense of responsibility for the role that I have to take and the responsibility I have to take for trying to keep our country as free as it can be. We measure 159 countries, and we have an index of how free they are. The U.S. unfortunately ranks 17th, and my aspiration is for myself and Cato to do what we can to return it to a position, you know, much closer to the top. Russia, I think, ranks around 126th. So I feel that we need to make sure people are aware of what the state of freedom is in other countries and the challenges that people like you have. But I also agree with Senator Paul. I think one of Senator Paul's important objectives is that even if we disagree with what's going on internally in a country, even if a country is someone who we might see as or many people in the United States might see as a foe, or a geopolitical competitor, we still need to have dialogue. And I think that's why Senator Paul is here, both to learn more about the situation in Russia, but also to advocate for dialogue and communication between the two countries. We have two countries that between them possess most of the nuclear weapons in the world. We have two countries whose militaries are in relatively close proximity to each other in the Middle East, and we all know instances in history of accidental wars or wars that shouldn't have been fought because of misunderstandings or miscommunications. And to the extent you have open dialogue, that helps reduce those risks, and I think that's in our interest. And just because you're trying to talk to someone doesn't mean that you agree with them.
And what do you think is a good approach for the U.S. towards the country like Russia? I mean, yes, having dialogue is great, but I don't think there's another reset button coming anytime in the future, right? I mean, you learn from your mistakes.
I think that's true, but having communication, particularly on that does help reduce the risks of it also, just like these walls develop, right? And it does end up increasing the odds of confrontation over time, and I think it's important to diffuse that. But I think it's also important to call out what we see in a country that doesn't that we don't like. I don't want the U.S. to. I don't think it's the role of the U.S. to directly influence or engage in the internal affairs of a country. But I think that if we want to live up to the values on which our country was founded, we need to advocate for freedom in other countries, and we need to call out things that we see where the state of liberty is not what it should be.
So having learned on your mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan, do you think America enters the new era of isolationism maybe? Or at least moderate isolationism?
There's this false dichotomy that gets drawn in the U.S. that if you're not in favor of these military inventions, you're somehow an isolationist. And no one advocates for more engagement with the rest of the world than libertarians do. Free and open trade, less restriction on migration, and those are the things that really do, I believe, counteract the competition and the conflict that can sometimes build up. It makes military confrontation less likely. I believe that it also helps engender freedom around the world, because trade helps people become more prosperous, which I think makes them aspire to a higher degree of freedom in their lives. For example, for decades, the United States had a ban against Americans traveling to Cuba. And I think that's counterproductive. First of all, as an American, I think I should have a right to travel to any country that will allow me to travel there. It's not for my government to tell me I can't go somewhere. But also I think that when people in countries that are not free see free and prosperous people visiting, they often say, hey, I want some of that. And that helps ignite, you know, movements for freedom around the world.
It helped ignite movement for freedom in the Soviet Union as well, because people saw those tourists coming from the States, from Europe.
Absolutely.
And, they were so much better off than the local population. Last question about freedom, and that's very important. So why American dissidents like Edward Snowden do not have any real support from American politicians? And how come Edward Snowden, the only place Edward Snowden found refuge is in Putin's Russia, you know, oppressive, enemy of freedom, all those things. But it's the only place that actually granted him asylum. How is that possible? When it happened, it's just, I was sad and disappointed.
As an American, that makes me sad as well. So there are people who call him a hero. I'm not sure whether he is or not, because I don't know his motivation. I think some people also feel that they're unsure of what other information he might have divulged to foreign governments. But I say unequivocally, I'm glad that he did what he did, because it helped expose, you know, a very significant issue in the United States with respect to government surveillance. Senator Paul, I think, says, I think he said in the past, and I don't want to misquote him, but he said that he would like to have Edward Snowden come back and be accountable for laws that he may have broken, but at the same time we would need to hold James Clapper accountable for the fact that he wasn't truthful when asked by Senator Wyden whether the NSA was collecting information on millions of Americans. And so if we're going to ask, you know, Edward Snowden to be accountable for his actions, we should insist that James Clapper be as well. Sorry if it was too political. But
no, that's good. That's good. It's going to be interesting. I need to say goodbye to the audience, and then it's going to be in Russian.
I will say that I'm sorry I don't speak Russian, but you know, it's been a pleasure to be in Russia. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and as I said, I'm very inspired by what you're trying to do here, bringing a message of liberty and the libertarian philosophy to more people in Russia.
Thank you very much. Спасибо, что смотрели меня. Меня зовут Михаил Светов. Ставьте лайки, подписывайтесь на канал, присылайте биткоины, если вам нравится, что я делаю. До новых встреч. Thank you, Peter. That was a pleasure.
Okay, great. Yeah, sure.
Awesome.